Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerer's Guild. Today on Sorcery Self-Defense, we are going to be discussing Cantrip Spells. A cantrip is a spell that functions on the intent, form, charge, containment model, and relies heavily on the law of repetition. However, it is not fully completed until you then release that energy at an opportune moment, giving us the ability to create a powerful spell in a short amount of time in an emergency situation. Okay, now as I said, the cantrip spell relies heavily on the law of repetition. The law of repetition states, every time a concept is repeated, the power of its faith increases. What this means for our spell work is that every time you repeat the spell, every time you go back over the statement of intent or whatever ritual you have connected to your cantrip spell, it increases its power. It gives momentum to that spell, and over time that builds up. You want to think of a cantrip spell almost like a snare, but the spring is just getting tighter and tighter every time that you repeat the ritual. Every time you repeat the ritual, you're pulling that rope just a little bit tighter, and there's just a little tiny gesture. It's a little tiny thing holding all that together. And as soon as you make that gesture, as soon as you speak that word, whatever it is you choose to connect to that spell, it breaks, and all that energy releases and comes out. And that's the beauty of a cantrip. Okay, now the reason that we're in front of my altar here today, instead of the usual backdrop, is that I am going to show you one of my personal favorites of my cantrip spells. This is a Crystal Garden cantrip that I have been working on. I have several videos on the creation of this Crystal Garden, but we're going to go over it. Okay, so it started with me putting out the Crystal Garden. And how you create a crystal garden is you get super saturated saline water. What that means is you heat up a bunch of water, or a small amount of water, excuse me, and you get it as hot as you can, up above boiling, and then you mix this salt in and just mix it in and mix it in and mix it in until no more salt can mix in. And then you place that in a bowl, such as this one here, and as it dries, the crystals begin forming on the outer edge of the bowl. The more you do this, of course, the more it will build up. And the beauty of this method is that salt crystals are a fractal pattern, so they can become part of the actual form of the spell, and then you have the form of the spell linking down to even a microscopic level. Okay, so once I had that going, I attached my personal sigil to the crystal garden and focused my intent through it. And then there's a hagstone in here that helps open up to the other side, and it's actually connected to my pocket reality. But we won't get into all that. That's a bit too confusing. Let's just go over the basics of how the spell was created. So, the intent is my will. And that was given the form of my personal sigil into this crystal garden. And how I repeat the spell is by adding additional salt and water while focusing on my own will and reminding myself what that final gesture will be when I draw upon that energy. And so when I draw upon that energy, of course, we need a sigil connected to it or some type of visualization. Many cantrip spells are actually connected to power bundles, so there isn't a sigil connected to it. An example of that would be my turtle shell that is on my Dreamcatcher, that is part of my usual backdrop. I'm sure you've seen it many times. You probably didn't know what it was. But if you look in the back scene, there's a turtle shell in the Dreamcatcher. That is part of one of my protection cantrips, and I actually just focus on the pouch itself when I am calling upon it. And that is an example of a power bundle cantrip. But back to the Crystal Garden one, before we get rambling too far today, huh? Okay, so we have the intent of my personal will given the form of the crystal garden, and then I put the energy into that each time I repeat the ritual of adding more salt, adding more water. That satisfies the law of repetition, reinforces the concept, adds to my will. And each time I do that, in this case, the fractal shape and form of the spell physically increases. Okay, so as I'm doing that, I remind myself what the gesture is. But I do not complete the gesture when I'm doing the rituals. I wait until an opportune moment. Now, with this type of cantrip, I have it set up so that I can use it over and over again. But when I want to use it, I charge myself, like we discussed in many of the sorcery self-defense videos before this. And I imagine that energy, and as it reaches down into my hand, I visualize my personal sigil, and rather than sending that energy down my entire body, in this case, I'm simply sending it down my arm, through my shoulder, down my arm, my forearm, and when it reaches here, I imagine it going into my thumb and my forefinger. And as I imagine that energy going in, I also begin visualizing the sigil and how the spell is released. Look at the hand gesture of me snapping my fingers. And when I do that, the spell is released, and whatever it is that I intend through my will is released through the sigil. And it's not just that small amount of energy of me snapping my fingers. It's all the energy I've built up since the last time I drew from the crystal garden and pulled the energy into myself, down my hand, and released the spell. Okay, so that will be it for this video. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. And don't forget to join us for the next episode of the Sorcerer's Shadow, Volume 1. The next essay that we'll be discussing in that series is how to create a successful spell. Okay, until then, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.